Okay, so we've been learning about the action potential, and the last module that we learned we learned about this resting potential, and we learned about what maintains the resting potential of -70, and we learned that this is a semi-permeable membrane. But now what I didn't tell you about is all along an axon there's something called voltage activated gates. So there's these little gates that are embedded into the axon, gates located along the cell membrane that are opened or closed according to voltage readings. So remember I told you about that term depolarization? So these voltage activated gates is what they're doing is they're constantly monitoring the voltage. So they're kind of saying, what's the voltage? -70. What's the voltage? -68. What's the voltage? -66. What's the voltage? -50. Oh, -50. Wow. Okay. So they're voltage activated. Let's see what's going to happen if we hit something called threshold. Okay. Threshold is 15 millivolts from the resting potential. So in our example, it's -55 because -70 minus 15 would be, well, getting more positive would be a -55. But let's say that the resting potential was 90, so then the threshold would be -55. So threshold -55 is once enough sodium has come in and the inside of the neuron is not -70 anymore, it's gone all the way to -55, then what happens is those voltage activated gates, they open wide. And they open wide and the sodium rushes in. Now you say, why would the sodium rush in? Well, the sodium rushes in because one, the gates are open, and remember it's got two forces on it. It's the concentration gradient and it's got the electrical gradient that are just pushing it in. So once the sodium rushes in, that's an action potential. The inside of the cell goes from negative to positive. It reverses in polarity. Let's see. Okay? An action potential. When the inside of the cell goes from negative to positive, this is what releases the neurotransmitter. So let's take a look at this animation.
The fundamental task of a nerve cell is to receive, conduct, and transmit signals. Neurons propagate signals in the form of action potentials, which can travel great distances along an axon without weakening. To transmit an action potential over such a distance without weakening requires that the signal is continuously reamplified along the way. The central molecular players in this process are the voltage-gated sodium channels, which undergo a cycle of finely choreographed conformational changes. When an action potential passes, sodium channels open in response to membrane depolarization. Sodium ions rush into the axon, further depolarizing its membrane. Within a fraction of a thousandth of a second, however, the sodium channels switch to a new inactivated state, in which they are closed, but now also refractory to reopening. In this way, the membrane potential can recover quickly after an action potential has passed. The sodium channels then reconvert to the closed state, ready to be opened again when the next action potential is encountered. Let's examine the changing state of the sodium channel during an action potential. When no stimulus is present, the sodium channels remain closed, and the electrical potential measured across the membrane remains constant. However, if a depolarizing stimulus is applied by a brief pulse of electric current, the membrane will start to depolarize, away from the resting potential of about -80 millivolts. Some of the sodium channels will open, permitting sodium ions to enter the axon along their concentration gradient. If the depolarization is sufficient, even more sodium channels open, and the membrane potential rapidly approaches the equilibrium potential for sodium, about +40 millivolts. At this point, the sodium channels close, adopting the inactive conformation, where the channel is unable to open again even though the membrane potential is still depolarized. The sodium channels will remain in this inactivated state until a few milliseconds after the membrane potential returns to its initial negative value. The action potential is propagated along the length of the axon in only one direction. By examining the membrane potential and state of the sodium channels along a length of the axon, we can see why this is so. As a depolarizing stimulus reaches our section of the membrane, sodium channels open and current flows into the axon. This in turn depolarizes adjacent sections of the membrane, causing adjacent sodium channels to open, and the action potential is thus propagated along the axon. Sodium channel inactivation prevents the depolarization from spreading backward along the axon.